Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all again. And I'd just like to extend a warm welcome to Nigel Fenwick, along with our participants. I'll pass over to you in a moment. Nigel's going to share with us some of his experiences working with Skore, particularly around systems architecture, discovery, moving into software implementation. But it's not for me to steal Nigel's thunder, so I shall, with that note, pass straight over to you, Nigel.
Thanks, Angus. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So hopefully you can all see my screen now.
Yeah, we can see it, Nigel.
Okay, good. So just a bit of context for you about what we do and who we are. So let me get down to the next slide. So at Thinkers, we help organizations make decisions about the systems that they use to run their businesses. And that's things like ERP systems, CRM systems. It can be systems for professional services businesses that deal with things like timesheets and time booking and that type of thing, and billing. And what we believe we do is we help them think clearly, choose what they should do, and then help them to do it. And we summarize that by saying we help them make things happen. And we're doing that. The sorts of businesses we're working with and organizations are small, medium-sized businesses. And when I say we, I mean myself and Martin, who's also on this session today. We describe ourselves as experienced grey-haired engineers. We've known each other and worked in manufacturing and software since 1981. And Thinkers was set up in 2008. And we do nearly all the work ourselves, occasionally using a couple of associates. Our axiom is think, choose, forge, use. And what we say to people is that if you spend a little bit more time up front thinking about what it is you're trying to achieve, and a bit more time about making a good choice in your of systems that you are using, you will actually get to the point at which you're able to use them and get a return on your investment a lot quicker. If what you do is dive straight in and make your choice on the recommendation of somebody you met in the pub, you then inevitably invariably spend months, if not years, actually implementing the system, and you don't actually get to use it quite so quickly. So what I'm going to do today is this came out of a session a couple of weeks ago, a drop-in session a couple of weeks ago. And it was just to tell you a bit about how we've used Skore in what I would say is perhaps not in a slightly different way from the way that you might normally feel that you should be using Skore. And I'll start off with a story about a customer of ours who sold equipment sells equipment into the entertainment industry. For them, time is always tight. They're always up against it on deliveries. And they have to get product to customer on time because guess what? The show must go on. They were using Sage 50 and Sage Manufacturing as an add-on. They had a serial number database for the equipment that they sold, which was a giant spreadsheet. But they kind of got to the point where they felt they couldn't continue to grow as a business and continue with the systems they had. And the software they were using wasn't helping them as much as they really thought it should. So they decided that what they needed to do was adopt a new system, probably an ERP system, but they didn't really know how to go about making that choice, and they wanted some help. So they got in touch with us. And we said, guess what? That we thought the first thing they should do is think first. The reason we say that is because when you're going to go through a program of change, the key things we think you want to be doing are creating a shared vision of the business and engaging key staff on that journey from where you're at to where you're trying to go as early as possible. We're also trying to characterize the broad scope and functionality that you want from your systems right up front so that you can start getting to understand the size of the gap between where you're currently at and where you're trying to get to. So that's why we're proposing Think First. And fortunately for us, this prospect turned into a customer and they said, yeah, actually, we like the idea of that. Please come and help us. The methodology we use is something that we've recently discovered is termed Appreciative Inquiry. And the questions we ask are, what works well? What doesn't work so well? What don't you do that you should do? And what do you do that you shouldn't do? And this is key. It's about making sure that when you're selecting a new system, you're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, there is always some good stuff that you're doing in your business, and you want to keep hold of that. You don't want to be ignoring it. It's not about focusing in on the things that don't work well and just trying to fix them. You've got to be looking at what works right already, because you've got to keep that in any new system. So we engaged with this customer, we ran some workshops, and out of that, I was able to use Skore to draw a landscape of their systems as they existed and what we might do if they were to change those systems. And here's that picture that I drew using Skore. So as you can see, there are no arrows, there are no Y boxes. I've used the what boxes in quite a different way than you might normally use them. The what boxes represent the systems and they're using, and where you would normally put roles, I've effectively got data and transactions. And what I've done here is the blue boxes in the center kind of represent their actual software applications that they use. And the green boxes are those things around the edges that it seems that all small and medium-sized businesses do with things like spreadsheets. And you'll see, so I've shortened spreadsheet to SS. There are a lot of spreadsheets that sit around the edges supporting the software applications they're trying to use in the center. So this was kind of their as is. And what we were able to do is just go, right, if you were to utilize an ERP system, and a lot of people were going, well, don't understand what an ERP system is. So part of the process here is to get everybody to understand what an ERP system will do for them. We could show them quite quickly that here are all the things within your current systems landscape that an ERP system would pick up for you. And we colored those in purple. They're the ones on purple boxes. And the orange boxes are those things that you might do on an ERP system, but you might not in their case. So it might be that that's actually where you ended up with all of those aspects being covered within an ERP systems architecture. The remaining blue boxes were those applications that we looked at and we said, well, we don't think they are not in your business systems process landscape. They're doing things like CAD, their design software. They were things that were just, not part of an ERP landscape. And then we also went into a bit more detail And I've done a little, I mocked up an example just so I could do these slides. So if we took the Sage manufacturing, and we're talking about parts, quotations, sales orders, you can use Skore to kind of drill into that and drill through into those the data and transaction elements, and then capture what we were being told about those things. So when we were asking them about parts, we just could use this just to capture, well, what did they tell us about parts? And you'll note here that so each of the purple boxes kind of what they told us, and then the white boxes was the, and they told us a bit more. So they told us that parts are identified using a 7-digit part number on Sage, but they also they then said, oh, and there's also a sales part number that's human readable that we also have on Sage. Now, what we weren't trying to do at this point was kind of start mapping out the process. We were just trying to capture what we were being told. And so Skore actually provides a great framework for doing that, as well as mapping a process. And of course, I've also shown on here that we can use kind of a note at the bottom just to capture further information. And here's what they were telling us about their materials resource planning, that the Sage MRP, the way they were using it was flaky. It caused database corruption, which was time consuming to fix. So we picked up a whole load of information from them about each element of the systems they were using. And that enabled us then to draw out in this process the things that were the critical factors for them in their systems, which for them were all about engineering change control and things like serial numbering, traceability, picked up all of that. Then pick out those things that were definitely in scope as part of a systems project, those things that were optional, and those things that were definitely not in scope. So, and that's how we move forward. And that drew us into a conclusion for them, which was they actually had fewer non-system related, not so good points than we usually see. There was nothing going on with their business that was going to impact a systems implementation project. There were some noises around communication within their business, but things that as they grew, they would need to be wary of, but we weren't worried about at this stage. And we always talk to customers about things that might be roadblocks to them in terms of a systems selection and implementation versus those things that might just cause a few them to go over a few speed bumps, but that wouldn't actually hold things up too badly. And we didn't find anything in this case that we thought were roadblocks. There were some critical factor things that were inevitably come out as speed bumps along the way, but that wouldn't stop them moving on. So having got that top level picture of what they needed their systems to be good at, critically good at, what things it needed to do and what things were optional, we were then able to move into a software selection process with them. And that's where we start looking at individual business processes in a bit more detail, start using Skore in what I would describe as a more normal way to establish the as is and envisaging the to be, and then using that knowledge to build a script that we could use when each of the vendors were doing demonstrations that they would work to. And so at this point, this is where we get something that's a little bit more like you would normally think you'd use Skore. But even here, in the role boxes, I still put in the system rather than a person role. I'm still trying to capture, well, what system is this going on in? And these boxes are coloured. There is some meaning behind the colour. I'm not going to go into it here. So this was just our picture of their the current sales process they were running with, which I'm not going to go into the detail, but as you can see, is looking pretty complicated. Whereas we could show them that if with an ERP system, this was where they could end up in a much simpler process. And that's it from me really, in terms of, that's just a couple of ways that as I say, we've been using Skore with our clients that's slightly different to the normal way that you might expect Skore to be used. So, any questions?
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. Just while people sort of compose themselves and think of some questions, I just wanted to say that was really interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Craig, maybe you'd like to start us off just in terms of, you know, how you respond to what you've seen Nigel doing there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Nigel. I loved it. I was a bit nervous at the beginning when you said we're using it in a way that isn't how you might think to use it. But actually, I really like the way you'd use the structure, that ability to break things down into more and more detail and create a framework. And interestingly, it's the second time in the last 7 days that I've seen somebody doing that. In that, in the other example, they'd taken a sort of industry standard process framework, essentially built it into Skore, and then used it in a series of workshops to help interrogate the business to understand what the requirements were at different levels. So, sort of similar type of approach to the way you'd done it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think where I feel we're at with this, we kind of haven't, we haven't refined what we're doing with it in this sort of context yet. I mean, I feel we could be doing it. I don't think we've got it repeatable yet. You know, I think and I'm looking to, you know, see how I can move forward with it and make it more repeatable. So at the moment, and kind of actually be able to use it interactively more in our workshops. Those examples I did, which were the first ones we did, you know, I kind of drew them after the workshops rather than actually be able to capture some of that using Skore during the workshops. I'm not quite efficient enough yet.
I think what would be quite interesting, what in the example I gave, the other business that I spoke to, it was the end of last week actually, what we were helping them there with is that they pre-built the sort of architecture, if you like, and then we helped them put a questionnaire against each step, against each box, which they used to drive the conversation in the workshops. So at that point, it was like, let's talk about this box, and then let's fill in the details against each of the boxes. So that could be something to explore. The other thing I think was quite interesting is something that, again, Colin might have more to say on this, but we've been thinking about and looking at is actually where you've been capturing systems on the what boxes. We've been looking at, could we actually sort of have another type of role, if you like? So we've got people roles and then system roles.
Yeah. That as I was, when I came up and thought, actually, what am I, you know, when I was looking at that and I thought, oh, you know, I haven't used people roles here, I'm using systems. It did occur to me that maybe capturing that ability to capture both, you know, who's doing it, but on what system, might be actually quite useful.
Yeah. The last comment I'd make, I love when you said about the spreadsheets, and we've called them SS. One of my favorite things in the early days when we were using Skore and we were doing a lot of consulting with it, I used to love going in and then at the end of a workshop using the search feature and typing in spreadsheet and say, look, let's look how many times spreadsheet appears on the process. And it's, you know, people always go, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's very for us, when we're working with small, medium-sized businesses that are in a phase of growth, they started with, a system that's appropriate for, a small business, but then, they filled in the gaps as they've gone with spreadsheets. And the other thing we discovered as well, we also work with customers who've got legacy systems that have been around for years. That's another common thing that we find ourselves doing. And again, the legacy systems, that we find that, guess what, the missing functionality that people want in today's business environment is always has been filled with a spreadsheet. So yeah, very common.
And I'll let other people ask questions before I take over.
I was wondering what Norma Jean, Tanda, or Steve might have to say on the matter from their different perspectives.
Interestingly, we've used the cogs symbol to say and the name of the system in the role area, just hasn't given it the help and responsible and that sort of thing. None of that, but we just put it in. So there's a list at the bottom underneath the roles of what systems we used.
Yeah.
That's actually,
I found that works really well.
And that works well visually, and you can actually report on that as well, because you can filter on the icon and it will say these are all the roles that are systems versus the ones that are people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not claiming I discovered this. You guys pointed me at it, and but I found it worked really well.
Yeah, I think for us it's a combination of both. So sometimes we do use the roles to also say this is the actor and this is where they're doing the activity in. In other cases, we find it's useful to capture that in the custom fields. So you actually then use systems and then capture the system that they use under there. But this was some really useful insight. Thank you for sharing, Michelle. This was really good.
Yeah, Norma Jean, I was interested because you are fascinated to see your equivalent or similar, not equivalent to this, but what your Amanda was showing us yesterday. And as Nigel was going through, I was thinking in my mind where the parallels might be.
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, that's something that we definitely are trying to do as well. Just use that to show our value chains or value chains of our customers. And as well to do the context modeling. So we haven't actually done a context model in Skore, but that's definitely a need for us. It was actually quite apt that this came up today because one of our users was kind of concerned with how will I put up context models in Skore. And so this has been good to give us that kind of direction and ideas of what we could do there.
Brilliant. James, very good to meet you today.
Yeah,
you're obviously new to a lot of this. What's your reaction?
Fascinating. All the things you said about small companies piecing together systems and filling the gaps in with spreadsheets was just what I saw in a project that it's kind of ongoing, but completed the audit, as it were, for them last year, at the end of last year. Exactly the same thing. And the reason they wanted to move on because they wanted to grow the business and found that all the stuff in spreadsheets was effectively manually processed. And as volumes might increase in their operation, they realized they couldn't carry on like this. Yeah, it might have been useful actually to use the Skore's facility in the way that you did. I think it's a really powerful approach. And I guess you focus on the idea of thinking. It makes them think what is important and what isn't, and what is, they've just seen it somewhere and they're like blue screens or yellow screens or whatever it is, and think that's the significant part of it when it isn't. It's the underlying functionality or what capabilities that the software provides for them. Yeah. So yeah, fascinating way to bring that together.
Thanks.
Nigel, one thing you said, which I thought was really interesting, is you talked about how important it is to look at what actually works well, not just focus on works badly. And it reminds me actually in the kind of more human capital management world, where we often focus on people's weaknesses and forget to actually focus on someone's strength. And it just made me think in a way I hadn't really thought about it before. There's a correlation there, isn't there?
Yeah. No, it's one of the key things. You know, if you need to draw out from the business what it is that actually currently works really slickly, because the thing you definitely do not want to do is introduce a new system that doesn't do that key thing as slickly as the old system. You know, that just creates real bad feel amongst the staff that are using it. It's kind of like, right, this is critical, and it's, you know, very often it's down to, you know, we'll ask about things like transaction volume, because, you know, if they're, I don't know, if you're processing 1,000 sales orders a day, you probably want to be pretty slick at it. If you're processing one sales order a week, the fact that it takes you another 10 minutes to process it isn't a big deal. But if you're 1,000 a day and it takes 2 minutes extra to process each of those orders, that's a big deal for an organization. So you've got to keep, you know, things that work well, you've got to keep them, you know, keep that capability there.
I think that's a fine line you have to walk sometimes with the spreadsheet question too, because I've had this very recently where a particular team, one of the things that they felt made them very good at what they did is their flexibility and agility to deal with some complex problems. And they would say, well, we can do that because we're using Excel to manage it, and it's very, very flexible. And so it's about finding where does a spreadsheet work really well, and actually where is it just replacing a very manual or replacing some system that could be doing it better. And people are attached to Excel.
We go back to the starting the consultation with saying, what do you do well? What's good? It's very non-threatening and not confrontational, and it people will respond very positively to that. But you'd be amazed how rapidly, even without asking the question, they then go on to tell you what goes badly. Our record is 45 seconds. Really? They just spontaneously tell you all the rubbish as well as the good stuff. And you haven't been remotely confrontational in surfacing those issues.
Interesting. I've always felt when you get into talking about pain points and things, I always feel like it's not something you should start with for exactly that reason. It's because it introduces the negative right at the beginning, and actually you talk about, oh, tell me about what you do. How does it work? And then they'll open up very quickly.
Exactly.
But still, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? Of course, people focus on what hurts them, and even they themselves perhaps lose sight of what does work well and therefore is really important.
Yeah.
Good. Well, any further questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to suggest that we have done brilliantly to keep this time bound. Nigel, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
No, I hope it.
Thank you.
Seeded a few thoughts for people.
Right. Thank you very much. So, Tandu and Colin, we're going to stay on. So we're going to just deal with an issue we need to deal with. If anyone else has got any questions, please also just stay on for 2 minutes. I'll stop the recording now and wish everyone a happy end of Friday and a happy weekend.
Yes. Well, thank you very